let's go ahead and get ourselves started for this evening. We, again, have a lot of interesting things we want to cover for you. In addition to, I know a lot of you have specific questions about the assignment and things you're trying to finish up right now. So let's kind of talk about what we're going to do and maybe take care of some of the assignment questions first. What we'd love to do tonight is actually start, continuing to push ahead with your ability to model different things. And one of the things that will help you as you continue modeling is start thinking about the structure that's actually contained inside the building. So far, I haven't really paid very much attention to that. I kind of say that as long as things are less than 10 or 12 or 16 feet, I give you some rough guidelines about what kind of structure is required. But as we start building bigger and bigger and more complex structures, we actually do need to start thinking about how those loads are supported, how the roof loads are carried on down to the ground. And if we don't have some interior walls to carry some of those loads down, we actually use columns and beams and some of those different elements to kind of bring it all together and carry those loads down. So we want to start talking about just the structural elements and how you model some of those things. And I'm going to show you a little about how you create sort of a very basic structural skeleton and actually can take that forward into doing analysis. So the idea is that you can not only sort of put some placeholders in there for what the structural element sizes may be eventually, you can take those elements right out of the BIM model and ultimately take those over to a structural analysis package. Calculate what the loads are going to be, or calculate what the stresses and strains on the beams are going to be, and size them appropriately. So it's not necessarily something that you would do, but often as a designer, you'll put in placeholders and you'll pass your model to a structural engineer who will go through and do those things, and then they'll operate on your model and pass the model back. So it's just another, or it's an example of how we're starting to use the models not only for documenting your design, but ultimately to do the analysis. Okay, so we're heading in that direction. The other thing we want to talk about today is this notion of custom geometries. And the idea there is that as much fun as it is to go out to Revit City or seek.autos.com and find things, a lot of times you'd like to kind of create something that's unique to your project, something that's from you. And we'll talk about how we can do that in two different ways, kind of looking at component families and how you create those, and how you actually model things in place in your project. Some of you have been asking some questions about that as you try to get a countertop to fit a custom situation or resize some objects in a special way to make it fit within the house assignment. This is kind of the next logical step. So two different directions, one sort of more analytical, one more on the design side, but we're just going to keep on sort of building up the facility and start moving towards using the models for analysis as well as design. Okay. Before we dive into there, let's talk about some of the questions people are having about the assignment and to see if we can answer some of those. So, one question that a lot of people have been having is regarding the whole issue of floors and different surfaces on floors and how you might want to go through and approach that. So, let me kind of tell you some of the ones that are sort of on my list that people sort of continue to ask about. One is the whole issue of sort of floors, and there's this whole issue of really, what's a subfloor versus ultimately what's a finished floor. I'll kind of give you some guidance about how we can go through and model that. What are some of the other issues? Again, everyone has some specific little issues that we'll take a look at, and hopefully, after the class, and Lottie's here, we'll be able to kind of answer some specific questions. But are there any sort of big general questions people are having about sort of either what to do or some aspect of the model that's really kind of baffling you? Yeah, and so it's always, if you can generalize it, throw it out now. If it's something that's very, very specific to your model, we'll take it individually. A very interesting question. Okay, so this is kind of like site surfaces. We'll take a look at that. Any other leading candidates for things people would like to see? Yes.
More how to crop things, especially in 3D. I guess I just can't get it cropped correctly.
Okay. Okay, so cropping, and there's going to be sort of this issue of the section box versus the crop region, and they're both they both play into it. Okay. Any other leading nominations? Yes. Tagging. Okay. Actually, we're going to talk about some of that in here, but sure. Okay. Yes. Oh. Okay, let's think about that. Real life topo. I may defer that one for another night. Okay, but no, that's definitely on the list. Okay. So let's talk about some of these and see if we can knock some of them off for you pretty quickly in terms of what's going on. Yeah. Our first volunteers, they get their questions answered first. Okay. There's an issue about floors that people are somewhat, kind of confused about really, how to sort of think about floors in terms of, what I'll think of as a subfloor versus a finished floor. And let me just kind of talk about that for a second. In the Go Ahead Starting Point file, I have different floor types. One that's sort of a lot of structural and plus some wood finished floor. I have another one which is some wood and with carpeting on top, and a third one which is wood with tile on top. Okay, so here's the deal. If you start modeling, okay, and laying everything out for a house, what tends to happen is, what we'll do in the way it's really built is, if you think about the overall kind of interior area, we'll put something down that we'll call the subfloor first and then start building walls on top of it. So what will happen is the subfloor is really just the layers of the framing, the wooden framing, some sort of joist or something like that. You'll have a layer of the plywood on top of it. Okay. And that'll go over the entire foundation. We'll lay that out across the entire house. And that's what I'll call the subfloor. It really is just the framing and that little bit of plywood on top of it. On top of that subfloor, we'll actually go through and put in finished floors. Okay, so on top of that, in some parts of the house, we'll go ahead and put some wood in there. In other parts of the house, we'll put carpeting on top of that. Okay? But it tends to be sort of two layers, the subfloor and then the finished floor on top of it. What's confusing about your modeling is you want to sort of have the right finished floor, okay, but you don't necessarily want to go through and break up all the floors based on floor types every time a floor finish changes. Okay? So here's sort of what we would really do, and I'll tell you the shortcut for like how we typically do it just to kind of make it easier. If I was going to be really, really good about thinking about floors, I would actually just have a type which is the subfloor. A type which doesn't have any finishes on it whatsoever. And I'd actually lay that out across the entire structure between all the interior walls. Then for the finishes, just inside the boundaries of the rooms, I'd put a finished floor on top of the subfloor. So it's actually a floor on top of a floor. Okay, so that it's just the carpet or it's just the tile. I separate them out a little bit. So if I'm being really accurate, I do it that way. I'd actually model floors in two different layers. A subfloor that's continuous, a finished floor that's just room by room. Now, I tend not to do that. Even in my own residential modeling, I tend not to do that. What I'll do is I'll actually sort of put a floor that has the predominant finish. It's going to be a wood floor throughout most of the house. I'll put that throughout the entire house. It's easier to kind of keep them together as one. And then in the few rooms where I want to make a change, I'll put that little bit of finished floor only in those rooms. It's not actually accurate how it would be built. The truth is, we actually build it kind of with a subfloor and put the finished floor pieces in there. But this starts to get to be the difference between an accurate model for construction versus a design model earlier in. For what you're doing for this assignment, it's okay to actually not be 100% accurate. You know, to have basically two different finishes on top of each other, it's just sort of more expedient to do it that way. Ultimately, we'd like to separate that out and have a separate layer for the finished floors. But, you know, it's almost easier to kind of have one floor that runs predominantly through the house and a slightly different variation there. And why it makes it a little bit easier, the problem some people are having is if you start breaking up the floor room by room, it's hard to actually get all the boundaries to line up perfectly and make sure you're really taking care of them. So what happens when you start attaching walls, every once in a while I'll tell you, well, I can't join to that, there's nothing there. And usually what's happening is you hit a gap in your floor. If you draw a section, you'll see it. Okay, that there's actually a gap in your floor. But let me just show you how I'd recommend getting around that. And just kind of give you a rough guideline. So here's what I'm talking about in terms of floors. In general, let me go through and, I'm going to put some sort of exterior walls down. I'll do them this way. Okay, and on top of that, I'm also going to go through and put some interior walls. So I'm just going to break this up into a couple rooms in here. So here's the deal. When I go through and put my floors down, what I'll tend to do is, I'll even shade that so it makes it a little bit easier to see what I'm up to. Rather than going through and kind of putting individual floors into each of the different areas, I'll go through and under my floor choice, let's just kind of choose the floor. I'll choose one thing that I think is sort of the predominant floor type, like the wood finish floor, if that's going to be what's happening in most of the house. And you can actually see it has these layers. It has framing, it has subfloor, it actually does have a little bit of finish floor in there. So if I choose that one as being my predominant wood type, I'll draw the boundaries just the way we sort of learned to. I'll go to the cores, bring it around. And I'll finish that. Now, this isn't 100% accurate. I've actually sort of cheated a little by including the finished floor with the subfloor. Okay? It kind of works, but if I was really going to be good, and where you would probably take this later on is, I'll take that floor, and instead of having it have the finish, I would duplicate it, and I'll call it just subfloor only. So what's the difference between those two different types? The subfloor only type just doesn't have the oak flooring built into the top. Let me just knock that out. Okay. So this is one that's naked on the top. It's just plywood on the top versus one having wood on the top. Okay. Yeah. Let me go ahead and switch it back to the one that has wood on the top because, again, that is the one that I'll probably use more often than not. So how do you handle the individual rooms where you want to put carpet in a bedroom or tile in a bathroom or something like that? And here's the way I'd recommend handling it. We want to put another floor just in this bathroom that has the tile on it, but since there's already a subfloor, we don't need that part of it anymore. We just need the finish layer, okay, not the subfloor. So how could you do that? I'll say floor. I'll grab that tile floor, but this tile floor has the wood included too. So if I wanted to have a tile floor which is just tile, I'll duplicate it. Finish only ceramic tile. And what I'll do here is actually just take out these layers. So I'll take out the framing. Truth is, I have to actually push these things down. The finishes have to be, every floor needs to have a core, so I have to push the finishes into the core. Like that. So now I have something that's 3/4 of an inch thick, which is nothing but a little bit of concrete mortar and tile on top of it. Okay, so there's no subfloor anymore. It's just 3/4 inch thick of finished floor. So how would I use that? I'd come back in, and in this bathroom area here, I'll go through and draw like I was going to draw. These probably don't need to extend to the core. It's just going to be a finished floor within the boundary of the walls. And I'll choose that. Just choosing the interior section there. And let me trim that up so it looks kind of nice. I need to have a nice clean boundary. And what I need to do is I'm going to put ceramic tile there. If I leave it at an offset of 0, okay, then the top of the wooden floor and the top of the ceramic tile floor are going to be exactly the same. They're going to intersect with each other. So it'll look funny. It'll kind of bleed through and it won't read just right. So if my ceramic tile is 3/4 of an inch thick, what I need to do is actually put it on top of the subfloor. And I do that by giving it a little offset right here. So as opposed to leaving it at 0, I'll say 0, 0.75. So what am I doing? I'm taking a thin layer of tile and putting it on top of the subfloor. So let me say okay to that. Close it up. Now that's the tile layer in that room there. So why am I doing this? The real reason is I just don't want to break the floor up room by room, because then it gets hard to manage the floor and kind of keep all the different boundary lines intact. So what I'll almost always do is just kind of put the primary floor under everything, and then just do these little special cases in the odd little rooms where it's necessary. Okay, as a thin layer of finished floor. You can do the same thing. Think of like a rug lying on top of the wooden floor. It's kind of probably the easiest way to conceptualize it. So that's all I want to go do there. You can get into a lot of detail in terms of all this stuff. If you haven't done that in your model, no worries. Yeah, here's predominantly wood or whatever it is as your predominant surface. That's fine, in terms of what's going on. But just thinking ahead, that's how you start modeling that little bit of detail like this. And again, we always defer to ultimately how it'll be built, and the way it'll really be built is it'll be plywood everywhere or concrete everywhere, and then on top of that, we'll put the finished floor. So that's for So and you also got to ask a different way of, what if I don't want to put concrete in my lower bedrooms? Well, you put the concrete floor down, then you put a thin layer of carpet on top of the concrete. Like that is the proper way to model. But again, no one's going to beat you up on this first assignment or on the second assignment if you haven't modeled that way. It's really more like the big design idea. Yes?
Just a follow-up question. In the template you gave us, if we go to the room schedule and then add a finished product, is there a reason why nothing comes up?
Well, it's just that it's just not smart enough. You wish it would. Yeah, because by the time you go through and put that carpet in there, you've gone through all this work. You think, you ought to be smart enough to figure this out. And it's just not. Yeah, so you have to put something manual in there. Again, what will happen is, actually just in the scheme of building modeling, it used to be that we would draw things and you just fill in the text. Okay. Then no, now we have the ability to model it, so we feel like we should model every piece of floor separately, because then the estimator can use that to figure out the true square footage and the cost, and sort of more and more capabilities. It keeps ratcheting up, but it also creates more and more work for us as modelers. So that's kind of what's going on there. So does that kind of make sense about the finished floor and how you would do that as opposed to breaking every individual room down separately? Because it is. It just gets to be very hard if all the rooms, the boundaries don't always touch right, and you have to manage that. So think of just one big thing as the subfloor, then a finished floor. Okay, next up, sites and site surfaces. I'm going to kind of touch on those two things together. Zoom out. You might wonder where that site came from. I just made it up. But let's go ahead and talk about how you create a site and how it ultimately plays into this issue of dividing the site into surfaces or even bringing in real-life topography. You're going to try and tempt me to go down that path. I'm not going to go there today. Lottie, keep me honest. Don't let me go. If I go out to Google Earth, slap my hands. I'm not going there. Because it's a whole separate thing unto itself. Oh, I went to, actually, let me do this properly. I'm going to the Massing and Site tab, you might imagine. I'm going to choose the Topo Surface tool. First thing that's going to happen is it's going to complain, hey, you're trying to create a topo surface and the topo surfaces are not visible in this view. Okay, we can fix that. We need to go to Visibility Graphics and just turn on the topo surface. So I'll say VV or VG, either way, for Visibility Graphics. And I'll turn on Topography. Okay, now we're ready to create a topo surface. Turns out there's a couple of ways to create a topo surface. You can create a topo surface by placing points where you're just specifying individual elevations of how high the outground should be. And sometimes I do that by tracing a topo map. That's a really good way to do it. Another great way to do it is create it from import. And from importing, and this is the danger spot, don't let me go here. You have the choice of either going to a points file, which a surveyor may have given you. Okay, it's just a bunch of XYZ points. Or from an import instance. So where I'm not going tonight is I could show you that if you go to Google Earth, find some piece of ground, and actually export the topography as a bunch of DWG file. It's really just giving us XYZ points. we get those points and we grab them from Google Earth and we bring them in here, we can then convert that into topo surfaces. So another time I'll show you how you actually do that for your custom site. For now, we'll just place a couple points manually because it's really, really cool. Yeah, and it works very, very well. In fact, I even have a little video to show how to do this. So I could point you to that one. Remind me of that. I'll point him to the video. But let's go ahead and put some points in here. Here's how points work. Every point has some sort of elevation to it. So if I want to create some sort of a little bit of a hill, I can say that the front of the hill is at 0. I've placed a couple points at 0. This could be the bottom of the hill. If I want to start having something that goes further up the hill, I'm going to place a couple points at maybe 2 feet high. I'll put one over here, and I'll put one over here. As I place points, I'm saying in the topography at these specific elevations, that's the height that should be. It'll figure out what the contour lines need to be to make that happen. I'll put some more points in. I'll say that 4 is kind of here, and maybe over here, and maybe back there. So it has that little kind of ridge to it. Maybe it gets really steep towards the back, like 10 feet high here. Whatever it is. But I place those points, I say finish, and when I look at that in 3D, hopefully, I got some little hill kind of hanging around beside my house. Okay. Not a very exciting hill, but it's a little hill nonetheless. Okay. If we want to make our hill a little more exciting, I can edit it and say, that point there, that's not 10, that's 30. And that's 25 over here. So I have this really steep slope on the back of the hill. Okay. But ultimately, those points pulled out of Google Earth is how we create the real topography. But I'm not going there. Okay, next question. How do you actually break that up into different surfaces? And it is kind of a good question. You could go ahead and put some floor on top of this, or some ramp on top of it. It's kind of hard to actually do because it's hard to match the topography exactly. So if you would build it like a concrete walk that would actually have a smooth elevation, model it as a floor, put something on top. But if it's really more like a path, it's going to be made of gravel or something like that, we can subdivide this into different materials. Let's show you how that works. So I got my floor, or I got my little topography going there. Go back to level 1 again so I can see it. There's this thing, it's not edit surface. I always have to find where this is. It's either split surface or subregion. I have to remember which one's which. Okay. There's split the surface. Well, I should actually break it into 2 different pieces that can be edited independently. That might be useful if you're going to just kind of change the elevations within that area. So I'm kind of like taking the type and sort of breaking it into 2 different pieces. You can carve away a power of the hill, something like that. So splitting the surface isn't what I want to do. I'm just going to actually break it into what's called a subregion. Defines an area within topo surface. Okay, and what that's all about, that's just going to let me change the materials. It's going to keep the same profiles, okay, but it's going to let me change the material. As opposed to splitting, it would let me change the elevations. It would let me change the profiles. So if I say subregion, and I draw something like, I think I have to do it from boundaries. See if I have to draw a loop. I might have to actually draw a whole loop. Let's see if this works. I should have paid attention. Let's see if this follows the closed boundary rules, if I just have to extend across things. Lines must be closed loops. Not quite down there. I must need to do a little trimming to make that happen. Oops, wrong trim. Looks like it's trimmed, but I'm not guaranteeing it. Yep, did it. Okay. So now what can we do with this? This little chunk right here is considered different. So if I wanted to change its materials, the overall topography has a material that's determined by category. The category of the material that's displayed for site generally is something called earth. if I want to change the material just to this little path within here, as opposed to being by category, which is the default material for this category, I could choose that little guy. See if I can grab him. Just you. And I'll change the material not to by category, but I'll change it to gravel or concrete or whatever I want in there. Have a nice gravel? It looks like I have gravel in there. So I'll just make it concrete for now. We're going to talk about how to create materials. Probably in about 2 sessions. Okay. So now this thing is a little concrete path that's following, but it's following the top. So dividing it, splitting it, makes 2 separate things, so I could actually have a level ramp going down as opposed to kind of this following the contours where subregions follows the contours. Okay, next up, cropping in 3D. Let's talk about this. This is actually a fun one. Okay, 2 different big things going on, cropping versus the 3D section box. The 3D section box is a fantastic way of just kind of cutting through things. Every view can have a section box. The default 3D view, any of your 3D views can. Let me turn it on. There is the section box. So do you have a section box? And we're just thinking about how to control it. So section box just says cut things out so I'm not looking at them. So if I want to cut through the house, I'll just push it back there. And I then start having something that looks like a little 3D building section. Okay. There was a shortcut that we showed you that if you want to go through and have your 3D view match a 2D view, you can do that. For example, if I draw a section, like that. That's section 1 right now, I think. Okay. It looks sort of like this. If I want to have the 3D view match that, what I can do is grab the default 3D view, and I'll right-click on it on the view cube, and I can say orient it to match the section box. And it flattens it out, but then you can, okay. Now we have this section box hanging around. The section box cuts away the model. The cropping just cuts away how things are presented on the sheet. That's the way to sort of think about it. So even though I've gone through, let's stop with this. How does the notion of just using the section box striking? Is that part okay? Okay, so then the cropping issue is, although this is sectioned this way, it's not necessarily cropped. I still would like to go through and crop it so it's going to fit on a sheet. And how I do that is let me show the cropping region. So 2 different regions, they kind of overlap and look strange, but this is actually the boundary which will be printed on the sheet. So although I've sectioned it here, if I bring in the crop region and cut off some that way, you'll see it's kind of a weird thing. Part of it's cut away, the model's cut away, exposing the innards because of the section box. I cannot see it because it just got sliced off the side of the view, is cut away because of the cropping region. Okay, so those 2 things, it's confusing. They're very parallel, but they really control 2 different aspects. That make sense, Lottie? Okay. Yes?
So if I wanted to save that view and put it on a sheet for my 3D section.
What you need to do is take that default 3D view, because the problem is the default 3D view, you're going to keep on changing it. Duplicate it. Right-click and duplicate it. Let's rename this as my 3D section. Okay, now it's hanging around. The cool news about my 3D section is as long as it's hanging there, it'll keep that same until you explicitly change it. Over here, I can keep on changing around the default 3D view. Oops, wrong button. I'm going to turn off the cropping. Rotate this around. This one's kind of live and independent. This one's staying the same. And if you really want to make sure that there's no chance that you're going to accidentally change it, there's a little button right down here, look like a house that has like a little lock in front of it, that locks the 3D view, so you can't accidentally move the camera. So you might turn that on just so you don't stumble across it in case you didn't want to.
And how about getting rid of the box? If I get rid of the box in that view, does it get rid of it in all the 3D views?
Each view has its own section box. Yeah. Okay. And although it looks like it's showing up here, when you print it, it won't show up. Okay, so it's just hanging around there as a visual indicator. You can hide it. You can hide that section box. It's still active even though you can't see it. Okay, but if you hide it and you can't see it, then it gets a little confusing. Okay, last up, tagging. Let's talk about tagging. The big issue with tagging, more than anything, is that we'd like to have a way to correlate different things between different views. So the idea is I'll put in those doors or windows, whatever it is I'm doing. And the reason for using a tag as opposed to some text is I'd like to pull some information out of the database of information. So I'll say annotate, and as opposed to putting text in there, I'll just tag. And those are all window type 1s. Tagged it on the wrong side, but that's okay. And the nice thing is, if I change something, for example, oh, that's going to be a different window size right now. Okay, now that's window type 9 instead. And why I like the tag is that tag corresponds to something that typically shows up in a schedule. I don't think there is a schedule here right yet, so I'll create one that'll actually show it. So, schedule. Let me create a window schedule since we don't have one here yet. And we'll put in that thing called it's probably the type mark in that one. The family and type. What else in there? Put the count in. Okay, so you can see that 191 corresponds to these sizes, and that corresponds to what's on the plan. The big thing is just attaching those things together. It turns out tags can show other information too. So by default, the window tag is showing just the identifier, just the type mark. But let me kind of show you how that can actually change too. Let me edit the family. Turns out even these tags are defined as families. We're going to sort of start playing around with this a lot more next time. But there's this notion of some piece of text that'll show up in there. Okay. We can control which of the different fields we want to have show up in there. So right now it's the type mark. If instead you prefer to actually have the window size show up or something like that, no worries. We can actually bring the type name in. I'm going to take the type mark out. Say OK. When I load that back in there, okay, now it'll actually show the sizes. It can really pull any information out. So tag is really just a portal to information in the database. Just pull it out and dynamically linked. And the cool thing is, again, since it's a tag, it sort of has this property of being this dynamic portal. If I go through and change that, yeah, the tag changes automatically. So that's the value of tags. Is that kind of generally what you're after? What they actually meant? Yeah, no worries. It's, as we start changing the tags to show other information, they get more interesting. Yeah, because those numbers were pre-assigned numbers for these doors and windows, and you never assigned them, so they don't really sort of correspond to each other. Yeah, they didn't mean anything to you. It gets more interesting than if you start changing the numbers, like for the doors or windows, I'll make them A, B, C, and then it'll make more sense. Yeah, but it's really just, it's all about just changing the values in the database. No worries. Okay, those are the biggies. Yeah.
What's the icon for the section box again?
Oh.
How did you get there?
What happens is in a 3D view, it has to be a 3D view. It's down. Oh, it's in the view property. So when it says 3D view, you can turn on down there. Actually, I'm sorry. There should be a button somewhere in the ribbon. I don't think there is. I don't even know what. I don't even know if there's a keyboard shortcut. We want that to be there, right? But I don't know how to get to it.
Yeah, I'll check.
A lot of you'll figure it out. Yes?
I have a question about the visibility graphics.
Yes.
I draw some room separation line to make a room, and then I want the room separation to be invisible in all the views, and I can only change it
let's talk about that. That's a really good question. Okay, let's talk about this. The idea is, okay, we've gone through and we've made some change. We've changed the visibility graphics. In this case, he's using something called a room separation line, which is useful if you have a big open room, if you want to sort of subdivide it into spaces like a virtual wall. So if you want to change the appearance of something, visibility graphics is view at a time. So you'd have to go through change 1 view, 2 view, 3 views, stuff like that. Okay, let's show you another way to do that. I'm on level 1 here. I'm going to go say visibility graphics. So VG got me here. And let's say that, I'll do something that, since my model is very simple here, I'm just going to take the lines for the walls and just make them big and fat, just because that's something you'll be able to see really quickly. And I'm going to make them blue. Now, this isn't necessarily something that's sensible, but you'll spot it. Okay, so here it is. So this is that view. It's only in this one view. If I switch over to level 2, you'll see it's not in that view. It's only in that one view. So the question is, how can we kind of copy that around? How can we apply that? Turns out there's something called a view template. And the view template will store changes you made to a view as a group of settings and let you apply them to other views. So if you have a view and you set up a view like this and you want to sort of store those settings as a template, what I can say is, let me go ahead and create a template from the current view. Okay, that's just a stored group of settings. So you get to say, oh, it's going to be my big fat walls. And we can choose which things we want to do. Do I want to do the visibility graphic overrides? And you can even change, which ones you want to have apply or not apply. But you get very, very custom. You can control the level of detail, the scale, just anything you want to apply very consistently. It's a very good thing to use because then all your floor plans can have the same scale and shading, and it's nice to control things by templates, kind of a higher level macro to kind of keep everything in sync with each other. So I've got big fat walls, so I'll say okay. So this view right now, if I go over here somewhere, it'll even tell me that it's big fat walls. View name, view template. Actually, it's interesting. It's not actually applied here. We defined it off this, but it's not applied here. If I want to apply big fat walls to this, I can either do it down here and choose big fat walls, or even a quicker way, just to let you know, is if you choose them over here in the browser and you right click, you can choose a template that you want to apply. So I'm going to apply big fat walls there. So we're taking a macro or a group of settings at a higher level, just applying them all, putting it in there. So now, level 2 has that same sort of nuance to it. So that's just kind of a really nice, consistent way.
But if you use this template,
yes.
For example, if you want to include some furniture in one view and do not want to include the furniture in another view, but if you use the same template, then how about the furniture visibility?
Every template, you get to control what sort of things are included in the template as an override and what aren't. So if the template included the furniture as furniture turned on, anything you apply that will be turned on. So you'd have to have 2 different ones to do that. So it's relatively all or nothing. Okay. So what you should do is, if you want sort of subsets, let me sort of manage the view templates. See what we can actually change. So here's big fat walls. We want to include the visibility graphic overrides for the model. Okay, so what would I say? The visibility graphic model, we get them as a whole. We can't sort of get that finer level of control. Okay, we can control other things, but really the set of visibility graphic overrides, at least for the model elements, they come together. So we might have to have several sets of view templates to kind of get that finer level of control. It's kind of, I know what you would like, and it'd be nice to get that finer level of control that you can say, just not that I want to turn the furniture on and off, just ignore the furniture issue. It would be a better, but it's not implemented that way yet. You'd like the ability to control on a category by category basis. I get that. Other questions? No worries. worries. Let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to switch it up in terms of the order a little bit, just given the time, so we'll have a smoother flow. Let me do the part about creating the custom parts, because I think a lot of you will want that for the assignments.